The year was 1865, and the Wyoming wind carried more than dust through the pines. It carried ghosts. The war had ended, or so the papers said, but out here, miles from any town, the world hadn't caught up with peace. The land still smelled of gunpowder and blood. The silence still held the echo of cannon fire. A man named Elias Turner stumbled through that silence, one hand pressed to the wound, just below his ribs, the other gripping a rifle slick with his own blood. He hadn't slept in 2 days. Hunger gnawed at him. The cold bit through his torn coat. Every breath drew fire into his chest. Yet he kept walking, following the sound of water somewhere ahead. The sun was sinking behind the black ridges, and in that dying light, the trees looked like sentinels, tall, still, and indifferent. He reached the stream at last and fell to his knees, the taste of iron and pine on his tongue. The world spun once, twice, then went dark. Clara Winslow found him there at dawn. She had gone out to gather water, her shawl drawn tight against the chill. At first, she thought the figure by the stream was another dead drifter. There'd been a few that spring, men who'd lost their cause and their way. But when she knelt and saw his chest rise, weak and shallow, something in her froze. His coat was gray, his belt marked with the fading insignia of the Confederacy. Her breath caught. 2 years ago, that same color had stolen everything she loved. Her husband, Nathan, had ridden off in blue and never come back. She had buried the uniform herself when they sent it home, folded and blood-stained. Since then, she'd lived alone in a cabin of rough-hewn pine, trading furs and tending a small garden, keeping to herself. The world had taken enough from her. But the man on the ground groaned softly, and something, perhaps pity, perhaps old instinct, made her move. She fetched her pail of water, tore a strip from her skirt, and cleaned the wound. The bullet had gone clean through. He was lucky, if such a word still meant anything. She half dragged, half carried him to her cabin, cursing her own mercy. When Elias woke, the light was dim, the smell of smoke and herbs heavy in the air. His first instinct was to reach for the rifle that wasn't there. His second was to groan from the pain that lanced aside. A figure moved beside him, a woman, back turned, stirring something over the fire. "You're awake," she said without looking. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. "Where?" "In my cabin. You were half dead by the stream." He struggled to sit up. "Why'd you help me?" "I don't rightly know," she said. "Guess I'm not as hard as I ought to be." He studied her quietly. She wasn't young, not anymore, but there was strength in the way she stood. Her hair was pinned loosely, her hands rough from work. She carried herself like someone who'd learned to expect nothing from the world, but still refused to kneel to it. "Name's Elias," he said after a moment. "I didn't ask," she replied, and for a while, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the wind pressing against the cabin walls. Days passed. His fever came and went. Each morning, Clara would tend the wound, her manner brisk but not unkind. Each night, Elias would lie awake, staring at the low rafters, listening to the coyotes cry in the distance. He asked no questions about her life, and she offered no answers. Still, something unspoken grew between them, a fragile understanding built on silence. It was on the 4th night that he spoke more than a handful of words. "You live here alone?" "I do." "No kin nearby?" "They're all buried. Husband, too." He hesitated. "War." She looked at him then, really looked. Her eyes were pale gray, the color of morning fog. "Yes, yours, I suppose." He looked away, shame burning behind his ribs. "I fought for the wrong side," he said. "Didn't know it until it was too late." "Too late's when men usually learn," she said quietly, turning back to her work. The next morning, Elias tried to stand. His strength failed him halfway to the door, but Clara didn't help. She watched, arms crossed, as he leaned on the frame and looked out at the forest beyond. The pines swayed gently, their tops catching the light of the rising sun. "Beautiful place," he said. "It can be," she replied, "when it's not trying to kill you." He smiled faintly. "Guess that's true of most things worth keeping." For a moment, she almost smiled back. Later, When he was strong enough to work, he offered to help repair the roof, which leaked where winter's snow had pressed it down. She agreed, though her voice carried that same guarded distance. They worked in silence, the air full of the scent of sap and sawdust. Occasionally, she'd glance at him, at the scar on his jaw, the tiredness in his eyes, and wonder what kind of man he'd been before the war had hollowed him out. That evening, they sat by the fire sharing a pot of stew. The light flickered between them, throwing long shadows on the walls. Elias stared into the flames. "You ever feel like the world forgot you?" he asked. Clara's spoon paused midway to her lips. "Every day," she said, "but maybe that's a mercy." He nodded slowly, as if the words carried a truth he'd long suspected. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, carrying with it the scent of distant rain. 3 days later, Clara went out to fetch firewood and saw movement beyond the clearing, 3 riders, their shapes dark against the pale morning mist. She froze, heart pounding. They were dressed in dust-covered coats, their horses restless. She recognized the look of men who hunted things, bounty men, desperate for coin in a land that offered little else. She went back inside, her face pale. Elias looked up from where he sat by the hearth, sharpening a knife. "What is it?" "Riders," she whispered. 3 of them. His expression hardened. "How close?" "Close enough to see the smoke from the chimney." He stood, swaying slightly. "They're after me." Her breath caught. "Why?" "Deserter," he said simply. "Left the army, left the killing. They put a price on that." For a long moment neither spoke. Then Clara's jaw set. "You can't be here when they come." "I won't get far." "I know." Outside, the sound of hooves grew louder. She moved quickly, pulling up the rug and lifting the trapdoor beneath the table. The cellar was dark and narrow, lined with shelves of jars and roots. "Get in," she ordered. He hesitated. "You'd hide me?" "I'm not doing it for you," she said, voice low. "I just don't want blood on my floor." He climbed down without another word. She replaced the rug, wiped her hands, and stood as the knock came at the door, 3 heavy raps that shook the frame. When she opened it, the men smiled, rough and careless. "Ma'am," one said, tipping his hat, "we're looking for a fugitive. Confederate deserter, goes by Elias Turner. You seen anyone?" Clara's heart pounded, so loud she thought they could hear it. "Ain't seen a soul in weeks," she said calmly. "Just me and the trees." The men laughed, stepping inside without invitation. Boots scraped across the floorboards. One kicked at the rug, but it held firm. They lingered a while, asking questions that went nowhere, then left as the sun began to set. When their voices faded, Clara lifted the rug and opened the trapdoor. Elias looked up at her through the dim light. "They're gone," she whispered. He climbed out, brushing dust from his coat. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the quiet cabin. Outside, the pines swayed, whispering secrets to the dusk. Clara turned away first. "You best decide soon," she said, "whether you're running or staying. Elias looked toward the window, where the last light faded through the trees. "Maybe," he murmured, "I already have." The wind shifted then, soft and low, carrying with it the scent of rain and something older still, the beginning of a promise neither of them yet understood. The days that followed were stitched together by silence and the rhythm of survival. Elias stayed, though neither of them spoke of it aloud. The air between them was uneasy, thick with unspoken things, fear, guilt, the faint tremor of something that might one day resemble trust. Each morning, Clara rose before dawn to tend the garden, and Elias followed soon after, mending fences or hauling wood, his movements careful but determined. He carried the quiet of a man accustomed to loss, and though Clara wanted to ask about the life he'd left behind, she didn't. Some truths were better left buried beneath the pines. The forest had changed since the bounty hunters came. The birds were quieter, the wind sharper. Clara noticed it in the way the branches creaked at night, as though whispering warnings. Sometimes she'd wake to find Elias standing outside, rifle in hand, watching the tree line. When she asked what he saw, he only said, "Ghosts travel faster on cold nights." One afternoon, as the sun sank behind the ridge, he brought in a stack of logs and found her by the fire mending an old coat. The light brushed her face, softening the years that grief had carved into her. He hesitated in the doorway, caught between gratitude and something heavier. "You don't have to keep me here," he said finally. "It'd be safer for you if I left." Clara didn't look up. "And go where?" "Every road out there leads to a man with a gun or a debt to collect. You'll last 2 days. I've lasted longer." She smiled faintly, not with humor but with tired disbelief. "You sound like every man who's run from something." He stepped closer. "And you sound like someone who stopped running." Their eyes met then, and the space between them seemed to hum, alive with tension neither wanted name. She dropped the coat and stood, brushing past him to stir the stew on the stove. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, her voice low. "You should wash up." The conversation ended, but the thought lingered. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. The forest was too loud, branches cracking, wind shifting through the pines like breath through a whisper. He rose quietly and stepped outside. The moon hung low, silvering the world in cold light. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled. He walked to the stream and knelt beside it, dipping his hands into the freezing water. When he looked up, Clara was standing behind him, shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. "You walk like you're still being hunted," she said softly. "Maybe I am." She moved closer, her boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. "You could start again, you know. There are towns west of here. Men find work easy if they know how to build or shoot. I've done enough of both," he murmured. "And some things don't wash clean, no matter how far you ride." For a moment neither spoke. The water murmured beside them, the wind brushing through the needles overhead. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. She looked toward the cabin, its faint glow visible through the trees. "I used to," she said, "before I learned the world doesn't give a damn about what you want. It just takes." He nodded slowly. "Maybe that's why I stopped fighting it." Clara studied him, the lines of his face softened by moonlight. "You don't seem like a man who gives up easy." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "You'd be surprised." The silence between them deepened, heavy but not uncomfortable. She knelt beside the water, her hand brushing against his as she dipped it into the current. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent something sharp through both of them. A reminder that even in a world stripped bare by loss, warmth could still exist. When she turned to leave, Elias caught her wrist. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "For what?" "For not turning me in." Clara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Don't thank me for something I haven't decided was right." By morning, a fine mist covered the valley. Elias went out to split wood while Clara packed away supplies. She didn't notice the thin plume of smoke rising in the distance until the sun caught it, gray against the pale sky. Her stomach turned cold. She stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes. Smoke meant riders, and riders meant danger. "Elias," she called, but he was already running toward her, axe in hand. His face said it all. "They found a trail," he muttered. "They're burning homesteads now, working their way north." Clara's breath caught. "You think they'll come here?" "They will." "Then we'll hide." He shook his head. "No. If they come here, they'll find you. You can't lie twice and expect to live through it. I won't let you go alone." "You don't get to decide that." The argument burned fast. She told him he was a fool, that leaving would only lead him to death. He told her he'd rather face death on his feet than bring it to her doorstep. They stood in the yard, faces inches apart, the wind tossing her hair across his cheek. For a heartbeat, the fury turned to something else, something raw, unguarded. Then he stepped back. "I'll be gone by dawn." Clara turned away, unable to speak. When the sun rose, the forest was quiet. She woke to the sound of the door closing softly. By the time she reached the clearing, Elias was already a shadow between the trees. She called his name once, but he didn't turn. The silence that followed was unbearable. The day dragged by in gray light. Clara tried to work, but every sound made her flinch. When night fell, she built a fire and sat by it, hands trembling. The loneliness pressed in like a weight. Outside, the wolves howled again, long, mournful notes that echoed through the valley. Then came the gunshots, distant, faint but real. 3 quick cracks, then silence. Clara's heart stopped. She snatched the lantern and ran, the cold biting her feet through thin boots. The forest seemed alive with movement, the trees closing in, the wind clawing at her hair. She followed the echoes until she reached the stream. The lantern light trembled across the water, and there he was, half in the mud, blood blooming dark through his shirt. "Elias," she gasped, dropping beside him. His eyes fluttered, open, unfocused. "Should have kept running," he rasped. "Don't talk." She pressed her shawl to his wound, her hands slick with his blood. "You'll be all right." He managed a faint smile. "You don't lie well." "Be quiet." He coughed, the sound wet, fragile. "If I die here, bury me where we met." His fingers clutched hers weakly. "Beneath the trees. They'll remember." She shook her head, tears streaking the dirt on her face. "You're not dying, you stubborn fool." But his eyes were already glazing, his breath shallow. She dragged him back toward the cabin, her body straining under his weight, the lantern swinging wildly in her hand. By the time she reached the door, her arms trembled, her vision blurred. She laid him by the hearth, stoked the fire until it roared, and whispered prayers she hadn't spoken in years. His breathing steadied, barely. Outside, the wind carried the scent of smoke again, faint but near. Clara looked toward the window, her heart pounding. The world beyond those trees was closing in, but for now, in the flicker of that firelight, he was still alive. And though neither could yet name it, something had already rooted between them, something that would not die easily, no matter what the wilderness demanded next. The dawn broke slow over the valley, spilling gold through the trees like a final mercy. The air was cold enough to bite, sharp with pine and smoke, and the silence that followed the night's storm felt wrong, like the land itself was holding its breath. Emma stirred first, her eyes heavy with the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than sleep could mend. The fire had burned low, and across from her, Jack sat with his rifle resting across his knees, staring out into the mist that clung to the woods. He hadn't slept, not since they'd buried the men back by the creek. She watched him for a long moment, tracing the lines of wear on his face, the bruised jaw, the split lip, the distant stare that saw ghosts where others saw trees. He looked older than he had 3 days ago, though time hadn't moved much. "You'll wear a hole in that barrel," she said quietly. He didn't turn. "There's movement out there," he muttered. "Been hearing it since before dawn." Her hand went instinctively to the revolver at her belt. "Could be a deer." "Could be," he said. "Or it could be the kind of trouble that don't give warning." The words hung between them like fog. He finally rose, moving with that deliberate, quiet precision she'd come to recognize in him, the kind born from too many years living on the edge of a loaded gun. He scanned the treeline, and she followed, each sound amplified, the snap of a branch, the rustle of wind through dead leaves, even the faint groan of the pines. They were being watched. Emma felt it in her bones before she saw anything, and when the first rifle cracked from the ridge, she dove hard, the bullet chewing bark inches from her head. Jack fired back before she could draw breath, the shot echoing across the valley like thunder. 3 figures broke through the mist, ragged, desperate men. Faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats, their eyes hollow with hunger and hate. "Get to the horses," Jack shouted, but she didn't move, not until she saw the scarred man leading them, the same outlaw who'd ambushed the wagon train weeks before, the same one who'd left her brother bleeding in the dust. Her heart kicked hard, all reason stripped away by the raw surge of memory. She leveled her revolver, breath trembling. "You!" The outlaw grinned through his cracked teeth. "Didn't think I'd find you, girl. But fate's a funny thing." Gunfire tore through the clearing. Smoke, shouts, chaos. The world broke open around them. Jack pulled her down as bullets ripped through the trees, his voice low but fierce. "You want to die, you stay standing. Otherwise, move." They scrambled behind a fallen log, the air thick with the stink of powder and pine. Jack reloaded, movements quick, practiced. "They're trying to flank us. We stay here, we're done." Emma's pulse hammered in her ears. She nodded once, jaw set. "Then we move." They darted through the underbrush, crouched low, every step a fight, for breath. The outlaws' shouts followed them, cruel and closing in. One bullet clipped Jack's shoulder. He stumbled but didn't fall. She grabbed his arm, half pulling, half dragging him toward the river. The current roared ahead, a silver ribbon cutting through the trees. "They'll expect us to run," Jack said between clenched teeth. She looked down at the rushing water. "Then we don't." Her plan was mad, but madness had kept her alive this long. She led him along the bank until they found the narrow bend where the current swirled against the rocks. She tore strips from her coat and tied them around his wound. "You still able to shoot?" He grunted, checked his rifle. "Long as I can breathe." The outlaws were closer now, voices carrying over the river, taunting, hunting. Emma crouched behind a ridge of boulders, her revolver ready, her breath steady. Jack took position higher up, sighting down the barrel. "When they cross," he said, "you take the one with the scar. The rest'll follow." Her throat tightened, but she nodded. The moment stretched thin. The first outlaw waded into the shallows, boots splashing, rifle raised. Then another. Then the scarred man. He was grinning again, like he could already taste victory. Emma waited until his foot hit the far bank. Then she rose. The gunshot cracked through the morning, clean and final. The scarred man staggered, eyes wide, before dropping into the river. The others shouted, firing wildly, but Jack's shots answered faster, each one finding its mark. When the echoes died, only the rush of water remained. Silence returned, thick and fragile. Jack lowered his rifle, breathing hard. "That was for your brother," he said quietly. Emma stared at the river where the bodies drifted out of sight. The rage that had fueled her for so long began to fade, replaced by something heavier, emptier. She sank to her knees. "And what's left for me now?" Jack didn't answer. He knelt beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Whatever comes next," he said, "if you still got a will to see it." They stayed there until the sun climbed high, burning off the mist, revealing a world both scarred and reborn. The forest whispered with life again, the soft murmur of wind through the trees, the call of distant birds, the sound of survival. By noon, they'd gathered what little they had left and turned west, following the faint trail that led toward the mountains. Jack moved slower now, his wound bandaged, but bleeding through. Emma kept close, her revolver tucked beneath her belt, her eyes scanning the horizon. After a while he spoke. "You could turn back, you know. There's safety east of the plains." She shook her head. "There's nothing left back there. Everything that mattered's gone." He looked at her then, not with pity, but with understanding. "Then I reckon we keep going." They rode in silence for miles, the sun sinking low behind the trees. The land stretched endless before them, painted in gold and ash. When they stopped to rest by a stand of aspens, the wind moved through the leaves like a voice, soft, familiar, almost human. Emma closed her eyes. For a moment, she could almost hear her brother's laugh carried in that wind, could almost believe the world still held a kind of mercy. Jack watched her quietly, the faintest ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Funny," he said. "You ever notice how the wind talks in these woods?" She nodded, eyes still closed. "Yeah," she whispered. "It's like it remembers." The fire crackled between them, warm and fleeting. Somewhere beyond the ridge, thunder rolled, promising another storm. But neither of them moved. They'd faced death, grief, and ghosts, and somehow they were still breathing, still walking the same haunted path together. And as the night deepened, the trees swayed and whispered their quiet secrets once more. A love, perhaps too fragile for the world, but real enough to be remembered, between the trees, where no one else would ever hear it but them.